Welcome, friends, to another discussion where we try to look behind the headlines, behind the immediate noise of the daily news cycle to understand the deeper structural forces at play in our global economic system. I want to talk to you today about a development that is, quite frankly, momentous. It is a signal, a flashing red light on the dashboard of the American empire that the established order, the post World War II economic arrangement that placed the United States at the center of the capitalist universe, is fracturing in ways that the mainstream press is terrified to fully articulate. We are looking at the news coming out of Ottawa, specifically the announcement on February 17th, 2026, regarding Canada's defense spending. But to call it merely defense spending is to miss the point entirely. This is an economic divorce proceeding. This is a junior partner in a capitalist alliance looking at the senior partner and saying, "You are no longer a safe bet for our survival." Let us look at the facts first, because as Marxists, as critical thinkers, we must always ground our analysis in the material reality of the situation. Mark Carney, representing the Canadian government, has announced a redirection of approximately $340 billion US dollars in defense spending over the next decade. Now pause for a moment and digest that number. $340 billion. In the world of global capital flows, this is not a rounding error. This is a massive reallocation of surplus value. And where was that money supposed to go? It was supposed to flow, as it has for decades, into the coffers of the American military-industrial complex. It was destined for Lockheed Martin, for Raytheon, for Boeing. It was meant to subsidize the American aerospace industry, to keep the factories in Texas and California humming, and to prop up the hegemony of the US dollar. Instead, Canada has said no. They are taking that capital and they are turning it inward, and they are turning it towards Europe. They are canceling the purchase of the remaining F-35 fighter jets, the crown jewel of American military export, a program that is as much about economic tribute as it is about air superiority. And they are looking to Sweden's Saab Gripen. They are mandating that 70% of these contracts must go to Canadian firms to build sovereign capacity. This is the key phrase, sovereign capacity. You do not talk about building sovereign capacity if you trust your neighbor. You build sovereign capacity when you realize that your neighbor, who has historically provided your security in exchange for your economic subordination, has become unstable, predatory, and dangerous. This is a direct response to the unpredictability of the United States, specifically the policies and rhetoric associated with Donald Trump and the America First Arms transfer strategy. But we have to be very careful here not to fall into the liberal trap of blaming this all on one man. Donald Trump is not the cause of the decline of American imperialism. He is the symptom. He is the manifestation of a system that is eating itself. When an empire begins to crumble, it does not do so politely. It lashes out. It demands more tribute from its vassals. It imposes tariffs on its friends. It threatens to blow up the bridges of trade, literally and metaphorically, that sustain the very alliances it relies on. And what Canada is doing is the rational response of a capitalist state trying to protect its own bourgeoisie from the erratic behavior of a dying hegemon. We have to understand the history here. For 70, 80 years, the relationship between Canada and the United States has been defined by a very specific compact. The United States provides the military umbrella. It patrols the oceans. It guarantees the rules-based order, which is just a polite way of saying the rules that allow American corporations to dominate global markets. In exchange, Canada, like Europe, like Japan, integrates its economy into the American machine. They buy American weapons. They align their foreign policy with Washington. They accept a subordinate role. It was a trade off, subordination for stability. But what happens when the subordination remains, but the stability is gone? What happens when the protector becomes the racketeer? That is what we are seeing now. The protection racket of the American empire is failing because the protector is demanding too high a price and offering too little security in return. The cancellation of the F-35 contract is symbolic of something much deeper than just airplanes. The F-35 is not just a plane, it is a tether. To buy the F-35 is to integrate your military logistics, your software, your maintenance, and your strategic planning into the Pentagon's infrastructure. It makes you dependent. You cannot fly those planes without American cooperation. By rejecting the F-35 and moving toward the Swedish Gripen, and by insisting on building their own industrial base, Canada is attempting to sever that tether. They are saying we cannot have our national defense subject to the whims of a president who might wake up tomorrow and decide to put a 200% tariff on our aluminum or block the shipment of spare parts because he didn't like a comment our prime minister made. This is the logic of self-preservation kicking in. Now let's look at this from the perspective of the American economy. The United States has undergone a profound deindustrialization over the last 40 years. We have exported our consumer goods manufacturing. We have financialized our economy, turning it into a casino for the rich. But the one thing the U.S. still makes, the one thing it still exports with lethal efficiency, is weapons. The defense sector is one of the last bastions of high-tech industrial manufacturing in America. It is heavily subsidized by the state, socialism for the rich, if you will. The government takes your tax dollars and hands them to these massive corporations to develop weapons, which are then sold to our allies. When an ally like Canada says, we aren't buying, it sends a shockwave through the system. It threatens the profitability of these firms. It threatens the jobs that are tied to them. And politically, it humiliates the empire. This is why you see the panic in Washington. This is why Trump is summoning crisis discussions. It is not just about the money, although $340 billion is a lot of money. It is about the precedent. If Canada, quiet, polite, loyal Canada, the neighbor to the north, the closest ally, can decide to decouple from the American war machine, who is next? Will Germany follow suit? Will South Korea? If the U.S. cannot command the loyalty of Canada, it cannot command the loyalty of the world. And without that loyalty, without that network of tributary states buying American debt and American weapons, the American standard of living, which is built on this global extraction, is in grave peril. We must also analyze the rhetoric being used. Sovereign capacity. This is an admission that globalization in its neoliberal form is dead. For 30 years, we were told that national borders didn't matter for the economy. We were told that efficiency was everything. Why build your own tanks if you can buy them cheaper from America? Why grow your own food if you can import it? The market will provide. Well, the market is not providing. The market is fracturing. We are seeing a return to economic nationalism, not just in the U.S. with America first, but now defensively in Canada with Canada first. This is the inevitable result of a system that prioritizes profit over human need and stability. When the global supply chains are weaponized, every country retreats into a fortress. Canada is building its fortress. The tragedy, of course, is that this is all a squandering of resources. Think of what $340 billion could do for the people of Canada. Think of the housing that could be built, the healthcare improvements, the education, the green energy transition. Instead, because of the irrational hostilities generated by capitalist competition and imperial decay, this vast social wealth is being poured into defense. It is being used to build factories to make machines that kill people, or machines that are designed to deter other machines that kill people. It is a colossal waste of human potential. But within the logic of capitalism, it makes perfect sense. If you cannot trust the global hegemon to protect your trade routes and your borders, you must divert your social surplus into building your own military. The instability of U.S. capitalism is forcing its neighbors to militarize, draining resources away from social welfare. Furthermore, let's look at the internal dynamics in Canada. This move by Mark Carney and the Canadian leadership is a gamble. They are betting that the U.S. is in terminal decline, or at least in a period of prolonged dysfunction. They are betting that the short-term pain, and there will be pain, make no mistake, is worth the long-term independence. The U.S. will retaliate. Trump has already threatened tariffs. He has threatened to squeeze the Canadian economy. The Canadian bourgeoisie is split. There are those who are tied to American capital, who want to keep the peace, who are terrified of losing access to the U.S. market. And there are those, the faction represented by this new policy, who see the writing on the wall and want to build a more independent Canadian capitalism. This is a struggle within the ruling class of Canada, manifesting as a struggle between nations. We also need to talk about the Swedish option. Why Saab? Why Sweden? Sweden represents a different kind of capitalist accommodation. It is a smaller power, technologically advanced, but without the imperial baggage of the United States. By partnering with Sweden, Canada is trying to find a middle way. They are trying to acquire high-tech weaponry without the geopolitical strings attached to American hardware. It is a strategy of diversification. It is the equivalent of an investor saying, I have too much of my portfolio in this one volatile stock called the USA. I need to hedge my bets. But even this is fraught with difficulty. Can Sweden provide the scale? Can they provide the guarantee of supply in a crisis? We don't know. But the fact that Canada is willing to take that risk shows how deep the distrust of Washington has gone. This situation exposes the lie of mutual benefit that has always been used to sell these alliances. We were told that NATO, NORAD, and these defense pacts were about shared values and shared security. What we are seeing now is the naked reality. They were about power. They were about the projection of American power. And when that power becomes abusive, the alliance crumbles. The shared values evaporate when the economic interests diverge. Trump says America first, meaning I will squeeze every dime out of you. Canada says, fine, then Canada first, meaning we will keep our dimes at home. It is the war of all against all, the Hobbesian nightmare that capitalism always eventually descends into when the growth stops and the crisis sets in. Let's dig deeper into the America First arms transfer strategy. This policy, pushed by the Trump administration, essentially treats allies as customers in a company store. It demands that if you want American protection, you buy American goods at American prices. It removes the diplomatic nuance. It transactionalizes the alliance. And in doing so, it destroys the very trust that makes the alliance work. You cannot have a military alliance based solely on a transaction. A soldier does not fight for a paycheck alone. There has to be a sense of shared purpose. When you turn NATO into a protection racket, you destroy the ideological glue that holds it together. Canada's withdrawal of these funds is the proof that the glue has dissolved. The emperor has no clothes, and the vassals are starting to notice. And what of the timing? February 2026. This is not happening in a vacuum. The global economy is teetering. The contradictions of debt, of inequality, of climate change are all coming to a head. In this environment of heightened stress, every nation state becomes paranoid. Every nation state tries to grab what it can. The redirecting of $340 billion is a defensive crouch. It is Canada preparing for a world where the U.S. is not the guarantor of safety, but the source of danger. Think about that psychological shift. For a Canadian born after 1945, the U.S. was the bedrock. It was the constant. It was the big brother, sometimes annoying, sometimes bullying, but always there. Now, the big brother is seen as a lunatic with a loaded gun, and you do not buy insurance from a lunatic. You buy a lock for your door. This rupture also highlights the issue of technology transfer. One of the main points of contention in the F-35 program has always been that the U.S. keeps the black box codes. The countries that buy the plane don't fully own it. They can't modify it. They can't repair the deepest systems without American contractors. It is a form of technological colonialism. By moving to a model where 70% of the contracts are domestic, Canada is trying to regain technological sovereignty. They want to own the intellectual property. They want their engineers to understand the systems. This is a direct challenge to the monopoly power of the U.S. tech giants. It is an attempt to break out of the technological dependency that keeps the periphery dependent on the core. But we must not be naive. Canada is still a capitalist country. This sovereign capacity will be built by Canadian corporations who will exploit Canadian workers just as American corporations exploit American workers. This is not a victory for the working class of Canada. It is a shifting of which group of capitalists gets to extract the surplus value. Instead of Lockheed Martin shareholders getting rich, it will be the shareholders of Bombardier or CAE or whatever new entities arise. The Canadian worker will still be taxed to pay for it. The social programs will still be cut to fund it. The rhetoric of national security will be used to suppress labor demands, just as it is in the U.S. We can't raise wages. We have to build ships to protect our sovereignty. You will hear this. It is the oldest trick in the book. However, the geopolitical significance cannot be overstated. We are witnessing the fragmentation of the West. The West, as a coherent political and economic bloc led by Washington, is fracturing under the weight of American decline. The U.S. can no longer afford to subsidize its allies, so it tries to exploit them. The allies, sensing weakness and predation, try to break away. This creates a vicious cycle. The more the U.S. pushes, the more the allies pull away. The more they pull away, the weaker the U.S. becomes, and the more it lashes out. This is the dialectic of decline. It is a spiral that does not have a happy ending within the current system. The $131 billion for military hardware and the $201 billion for associated support mentioned in the report represents a complete re-engineering of the Canadian military posture. You do not spend that kind of money on a whim. This is a 10-year plan. This is a generational shift. It means that for the next decade, Canada is committed to decoupling from the U.S. military machine. That is a train that is very hard to stop once it leaves the station. Even if Trump were to leave office tomorrow, the damage is done. The trust is broken. The contracts are being signed with other people. You cannot just flip a switch and go back to the way things were in 1995. History moves in one direction. And let's consider the reaction in the U.S. defense industry boardrooms. These executives are looking at their quarterly projections and they are seeing a massive hole, 340 billion. That is panic inducing. They will lobby, they will bribe, they will pressure the US government to do something. And what can the US government do? They can threaten more. They can sanction Canada. They can try to engineer a regime change in Ottawa. Don't think they wouldn't try. We have seen what the US does to countries that threaten its economic interests. Usually those countries are in the global south. But now the rebellion is happening in the house next door. It is happening in the attic. This is a crisis of the first order. We have to ask ourselves, where does this lead? If Canada builds its own sovereign defense industry, it becomes a competitor to the US in the global arms market. A Canadian-Swedish fighter jet could compete with the F-35 in other markets. Brazil might buy it. India might buy it. Suddenly, the US monopoly is challenged not just by Russia or China, but by its own former satellites. This is the nightmare scenario for the Pentagon planners. It is the loss of control, and control is the currency of empire. So, as we watch this unfold, as we see the headlines about crisis discussions and billion-dollar halts, remember that this is not just a diplomatic spat. This is the tectonic plates of global capitalism shifting. It is the sound of the American century grinding to a halt. It is the realization that the system of alliances built to sustain American profitability is no longer sustainable. The costs have outweighed the benefits. Canada has done the math. They have run the numbers, and the numbers say, get out. In the next part of this discussion, we are going to look specifically at the American reaction. We are going to analyze the threats coming from the Trump administration, the bridge tax, and the sheer economic insanity of trying to bully your biggest trading partner into submission. We will see how this is not strength, but weakness masquerading as strength. But for now, let this sink in. The check has bounced. The U.S. demanded tribute, and Canada said, we're closing the account. That is a revolutionary moment in the history of North American relations, and it is a sign of deep systemic trouble for the masters of the universe in Washington and Wall Street.